COP27 starting in Egypt in the next few weeks, it has the potential to have tremendous impact on the policy environment around the world with regards to clean energy transition. But I think it's also important to understand that there are a lot of potential points of fragmentation and seams that may threaten to disturb any kind of global consensus or collaborative policy approach to climate change over the next 10 and even 50 years. But first, what does COP stand for? So COP is the UN's series of conferences about climate change, and COP itself stands for Conference of the Parties. The first COP to achieve widespread consensus and some sort of formal agreement about climate change was COP21 in Paris in 2015. At that particular conference, there was a worldwide agreement, a collaborative agreement signed by over 200 countries with regards to specific climate goals with regards to the change of global temperatures. So the target set at the Paris Agreement was of 1.5 degrees Celsius change as the temperature increase as a result of greenhouse gas. The goal was then for each of the parties that attended the conference and agreed to the Paris Agreement that there would be some form of national development policies implemented within their country that are specifically and explicitly targeted at addressing climate change and specifically achieving that 1.5 degree maximum temperature increase over the next 100 years. Now, fast forward 5 years, because the goal was to update the agreement every 5 years. That gets us to 2020. Now, obviously, the COP planned at that year had to be delayed because of the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns. And so Scotland, Glasgow, Scotland, hosted COP26 in November of 2021, which was last year. At that particular COP, there were a few updates and a few new trends in the way that the countries across the UN would start to engage about climate change. The first big change was the outright recognition that very few countries had actually fulfilled their agreement by the 5-year period, which was to have developed a national plan for addressing climate change and specifically for reducing greenhouse gases such that a 1.5 degree Celsius maximum was attained in terms of global temperature rise. With that many countries failing to accomplish the target and that little effectively actually being implemented over the 5 years, the concession was to shift the target from 1.5 degrees to 2.4 degrees. But in addition to that, there were also conversations more explicitly targeted at the end of fossil fuels, and one of the lowest hanging fruit being coal, because of the level of pollution that it emits at the point of combustion. But there we saw some of the interesting geopolitical divergences start to emerge, and that pose a significant threat to any kind of cohesive agreement policy-wise across the world. And this was over the issue of the actual phasing out of coal. China and India are by no means the only set of countries that have a heavy emphasis or a heavy usage of coal within their overall energy portfolio. But they happen to be in a place where between the two of them, they have somewhere between 33% and 25% of all of human population that they have to govern. So with that in mind, they take a very, by any means necessary approach to providing electrification for the entire population, because both of those countries still have issues with rural electrification. But it's not just China and India, it's most of sub-Saharan Africa. It's a significant portion of Latin America as well, where you have scenarios where you have meaningful portions of the population that do not have access to regular, reliable electricity. So in countries that have that type of situation, taking a by any means necessary approach to generating enough energy at a cost that's low enough for these rural populations to afford, you have no incentive financially to engage in that without some form of compensation from the part of wealthier countries that do not have that kind of issue. And so that brought out actually an additional issue that was much more fundamentally targeted at the starting inequalities that we have right now with regards to access to financing, because it's access to financing that ultimately provides the actual ability to implement any of these national development strategies. And in particular to that, there's also the concern that global north countries, such as the United States, such as members of the EU, Canada, only have something like, 20%, 15% of the world's population. But they contribute, no, actually less than that. But they contribute more than 25% of the total global emissions. So there's this sense that you have global north nations that are having their cake and eating it too, where they benefit the most from climate change reduction, but they're also harmed the least by climate change. And so in order to provide some level of equity, a number of countries have been calling for, in a more formal sense, climate justice, which is what kind of compensation or what kind of reparations are due to countries that are impacted disproportionately, especially disproportionately to their own emissions, by the negative and worst effects of climate change. Because that's what we're seeing, is that countries in the global south, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, but it's also in Southeast Asia, also some in Latin America, are impacted the worst and are experiencing the most amount of displacement as a result of climate change, and yet are contributing the least to the actual emissions that drive climate change. But there was a lot of pushback from the global north. There was great reluctance to actually even get into dollar amounts or even to discuss culpability in any kind of legal sense. And instead there were calls for more dialogue, which did not sit well with a number of developing countries that were really advocating for this. So the end result of COP26 was a bit of a mixed bag. There was agreement about the temperature, about realigning what the temperature targets would need to be, and then assessing what each country would need to actually sustain and set up to be able to move forward. But at the same time, we saw some serious fault lines within whatever potential coalition might actually emerge in terms of collective legislation to transition to a clean energy economy, because of this issue of the disproportionate impact of climate change on economies and on populations and on displacement. And so that's going to be a major point of contention for this next COP27 in Egypt. So some of the things to think about for this particular conference are going to be, number one, this climate justice issue. I think it's going to be front and center. But I think what's more critical about it is that when you look at the clean energy transition and you look at the new set of key commodities and minerals that are inputs within the value chain, it becomes very evident that we're going to get to a point where these countries have a lot more leverage. And so with that in mind, it's also going to be a significant point that we're going to see these countries use that to their advantage when talking about climate change. When talking about climate justice in particular. And then lastly, we're also going to be looking at the revision of these climate targets. So people trying to get more aggressive, going back to that 1.5%, because every inch that we get closer from 2.4 to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's millions of people's lives that are saved and tens of millions of people that are not displaced. So those are what I think are going to be the keys for a conversation in COP27 this year, and what some of the points of contention we can expect from that conference.